So we're all gathering here. And as like I say, it's always fun to see where people come from. And I'm back this week now I was traveling last week to answer some of your questions about modern politics. Just a reminder, my name is Heather Cox Richardson. I am a professor of history, but I do not speak for my employer when I do these videos. And just so you know, I am writing a new book. So my attention to, I'm sorry, I should be clear about that. That's due in a month. So my attention to the news is somewhat less than it normally would be, but I will go ahead and try and answer your questions to the best of my ability. All right, so let's start here with questions everybody asked about, and that is with questions about these Secret Service texts, which seem to have disappeared. Really interesting. Because if you think about everything that we're learning, about the January 6th insurrection, if you go back to when it happened, which weirdly I have done for this book I'm working on, there was the sense at first that somehow Trump had called people to Washington and had whipped them up, and the mob had spontaneously descended on the Capitol building, where the joint session of Congress to count the certified electoral votes was taking place. It is now very clear that that was not at all the case, that in fact there had been an attempt on the part of Trump and his supporters to put in place a much more detailed plan to try to overturn Joe Biden's victory. Now, just again, to put the ground under us, the election was not close. Biden won by more than 7 million votes in the popular vote and by 232 to 306 votes in the Electoral College. So that was the same spread, weirdly, that Donald Trump had won by when he ran against Hillary Clinton, and he called that a landslide. But now he's been trying to suggest that somehow it was a squeaky thin victory that he should have won. Now, of course, there were recounts of all the states that he requested a recount in, and the numbers came up very close to what they had been originally. And I'll tell you more about that in a second. And the Trump campaign, not the administration, the Trump campaign challenged the outcome of the election in more than 60 court cases before both state, federal, and also the Supreme Court, the court system. And in every case but one, which was a procedural question about how far people were standing from a table, as I recall, they lost because there was no evidence. And of course, since then, many of the people who had claimed to have evidence of the election being stolen have, when testifying under oath, have said, well, no, we didn't really have any evidence, especially Sidney Powell. So the election was not close at all. But what we know now is that there was afoot a plan amongst Trump and his closest allies to a many-pronged attempt to stop the counting of the certified electoral votes for Joe Biden. And those votes are going to be were certified in the states under different systems. And that certification process was elaborated in 1887 in the Electoral Count Act. And nobody had really ever challenged it. Now you hear people trying to make a false equivalence between what happened in January of 2016 and cases in the past when people have challenged the electoral count. But in fact, in the past, challenges to the electoral count from one state or another have been largely symbolic, and they have not, they're perfectly legitimate, but they have been symbolic, and they haven't stopped the actual counting of the electoral votes. This was a concerted effort to throw out the electoral votes that were certified for Joe Biden and replace them either with false electors that I can tell you more about if you want, or simply to create enough mud in the water that those got thrown out altogether. And the case either went to the Supreme Court, where Trump had said that the fact he had put 3 justices on the Supreme Court as quickly as he did would stand in his favor, especially Amy Coney Barrett. That's an interesting case. Or that the election would get thrown into the House of Representatives, where each state gets a single vote. And in that case, more House delegations were Republican than were Democratic, and he expected that he would win then in the electoral system in the House of Representatives. And so I know it's complicated, but the bottom line to remember always is that the American people voted, as we are allowed to, and even though the system really has been skewed since about 2000 and, I'm sorry, not 2000, 1986, when Republicans started to call for ID laws to stop what they considered illegal voting, even though that's vanishingly rare. Even despite the fact that it's harder for Democrats to vote than Republicans in America right now, the American people voted for Joe Biden 7 million more times than people voted for Donald Trump. So what they were trying to do was to overturn an election, which overturns the very basic principle embodied in our Declaration of Independence, which says that we have the right to consent to the government under which we live. And of course, the Constitution was written to put that principle in practice, but that's the organizing principle of this country. So Donald Trump, for the first time in our history, tried to overturn that. All right. So what's interesting about that, I started talking about the I see SS, I see Social Security, because I've been writing about that. The Secret Service texts that have been gone missing from January 5th and January 6th. What's interesting about that to me is twofold. First of all, we now know about the plan in the states to overturn the certified ballots. We know about the plan in the White House to overturn the ballots. We know about the plan among people like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and the 3%ers to change the outcome of the election. But what we have not yet learned about is what happened in the Department of Defense and what happened with the Secret Service. And those two things are still hanging out there. So, for example, we know that at the very end of December and into early January, Donald Trump changed the people that were in charge of the Department of Defense, putting in position a man especially named, in a key position, a man named Kash Patel, who had been an aide to Mark Meadows. And we know Mark Meadows is one of the founders of the Freedom Caucus, and which is a far-right caucus in the House of Representatives, and had gone on to be Donald Trump's chief of staff. And he was in office during the January 6th crisis. And now one of his chief people was sitting in a key position at the Department of Defense. He wasn't the only one. But what exactly was happening at the Department of Defense, to me, is very unclear. And I have spent a lot of time trying to untangle it, simply because there's many, many conflicting ways that you could interpret what happened. And it's not clear to me what that is. I will say that it does seem to me very clear that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark A. Milley, was determined to make sure that Trump did not have a coup, that he really threw his weight behind preserving the constitutional order. And he did that in reaction in part to what Trump tried to maneuver him into in June of 2020, when he tried to get the military to stand behind Trump rather than to stand behind the constitutional rights of Americans. And if you remember that, Milley came out in a really big way and said, I should not have appeared with him. I did not know that's what I was getting maneuvered into when he walked across Lafayette Square to the church. And the military will not do anything but stand behind the Constitution. And you may or may not remember, scads of military personnel from all the branches of our military came out after that and said, we stand behind the Constitution. That was a really important moment in our history for the military to have taken that strong a stand against what Trump was trying to do. And it speaks, I think, highly of them. I also think it speaks for the incredible power of traditions and laws like the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, which says that the U.S. military cannot be used against U.S. citizens. And while technically the Posse Comitatus Act only legally binds the Army and one other branch, I can't remember off the top of my head which it is, all of the other branches have said that they consider themselves bound by it. And there's actually a move afoot in Congress to make them actually legally bound by the Posse Comitatus Act. Unlike that, though, is the Department of Homeland Security, which is not bound by the Posse Comitatus Act. And that's a different case altogether that I don't really have time to go into now. Anyway, so why do we care about, we certainly care about what was happening at the Department of Defense and why it wasn't sending people out, and maybe it was sending people out and the messages didn't get through, and if so, why not? I don't have any of the answers to that, but I guarantee you that the January 6th committee has not forgotten this. They certainly know what's happening with, or certainly have looked into what's happening with that. But the Secret Service is a different kettle of fish altogether. And the Secret Service, as you know, is supposed to protect the president. And the history behind that is somewhat interesting. The Secret Service actually traditionally lived in the Treasury Department, because the Secret Service began as, and this is off the top of my head, by the way, so I may not get all the dates right here, but I've always been interested in the Secret Service because it began as a way to stop counterfeiting during the Civil War. Because when the U.S. government invented American money, like how do you do that? Like you say, okay, we're going to have this money, but then you got to have somebody design it. And in those days when it was, you didn't have the extraordinary instruments we have now, immediately engravers were copied by very good other engravers. And so one of the real problems with that is the number of counterfeit bills that were circulating around the country was actually causing inflation and causing a lot of crises in the United States. So the Treasury Department starts to have its own secret organization to crack down on the secrets, on the counterfeiters. Well, so what happens then is that the U.S. Officials don't have any kind of personal protection because they don't really think they need it. Certainly, there are attempts on the part of the Pinkertons to say they're Lincoln's protectors, but that's kind of a difference. Lincoln declined to be protected after he came into Washington in 1861 secretly, and they made such fun of him for doing that. He sort of vowed that he would never accept protection again, that if God wanted him to end his life, he was just going to deal with that without trying to preempt an assassin, for example. But that changes in, I think it's 1894, when Grover Cleveland is in office, and there's huge people whipping up hatred for him, quite like you see today. And he was getting so many death threats that people in the administration figured he needed some kind of protection, especially after the assassination of James Garfield in 1881. So they looked for somebody who could protect him, and there really wasn't anybody except within the Treasury Department. So the Secret Service from then in 1894 began to protect the president as well. So the Secret Service lived in the Treasury Department, which sounds really bonkers, but that's why they were there until after the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, and then they get bopped over to the Department of Homeland Security, where, as I say, they really are simply under the purview of the president, without traditions, without rules, within their own branches, the way, for example, the Army has. Anyway. So the reason that we care about these texts is because it appears that we know that Trump pulled from the Secret Service a man named Anthony Ornato, whom he appointed as a political person within the White House, but he retained both roles. Now, the Secret Service is not supposed to be political. They're supposed to be people who are willing to protect the lives of our elected officials without regard to party, without regard to anything except their job is to protect our elected officials. And frankly, it is one heck of a profession, and they do quite a good job, or they always have in the past. It certainly appears now as if Trump was trying to turn the Secret Service into a political branch that protected him. Now, if you remember, once you recognize that, and this has really all come to the fore since Cassidy Hutchinson testified in front of the January 6th committee, in which she mentioned seeing, I believe it was Ornato, talking about how the former president had lunged toward a Secret Service agent when he heard he wasn't going to be able to go up to the Capitol. And it instantly two Secret Service immediately, not instantly, two Secret Service people alleged that they would contradict her version of events. They never did, and they never did under oath. And this you're going to see, or you have seen, you're going to see again and again and again, people taking issue with what is told before the January 6th committee and saying, oh, that didn't happen, but then not being willing to testify under oath. And this is really interesting to me because really since before the Trump administration, but in spades during the Trump administration, you had Republicans advancing narratives that were not true. They were not under oath. You saw this with Rudy Giuliani, of course, and Sidney Powell late in the administration, but you also saw it all the way back into the first impeachment of Trump, where you had representatives especially, but also some senators and certainly people on the Fox News channel screaming things that simply weren't true. But they never said them under oath. They sometimes set up things to look like a courtroom, and certainly Rudy Giuliani did a lot of that, but they weren't testifying under oath. And that's really important now, is to see what people say under oath. So Cassidy Hutchinson said under oath that she had heard this happen, not that she had seen it herself, but she had heard it happen. Two people said, oh no, that it didn't, but then they wouldn't testify under oath about it. And then it turned out that one of those people was Ornato. So people are paying attention to him and saying, wait a minute, what was somebody who was both political and part of the Secret Service doing in the White House? And then they started thinking, hey, wait a minute, remember how Mike Pence wouldn't get into that car driven by the Secret Service? Okay, so does that say, we don't know that. We don't know yet what that meant, and it could have meant many things. But certainly it looks as if he had reason not to trust what they were going to do. And that's a really big red flag, because we're supposed to be able to trust the Secret Service. People are supposed to be able to trust the Secret Service. Elected officials are supposed to be able to treat the Secret Service. And then people started thinking, wait a minute here. Remember how when Biden went into office, and they probably had to switch out a lot of Secret Service agents because they didn't trust them. Okay, now we're really into scary territory. If there really was concern about the protection of our president because they didn't trust the Secret Service. So now, of course, the Inspector General for the Secret Service, who was appointed by Trump, got out front of a story that appeared to be dropping. So you may remember, I can't remember how long it's been ago, but the director of the Secret Service, who had been appointed by Trump, a man, his last name was Murphy, resigned. And he was quite young. He was in his early 50s, and he resigned to go to Snap, which is the parent company of Snapchat. And at the time, I wrote about that, and you may have remembered, I think I even said, this seems to be the big story, even though it doesn't seem like the big story today. Because why is a young man, I think I know how old he is, but it's a little obscure, so I won't say it. He's in his early 50s. Why is this young man dropping the Secret Service and going to Snap for a much smaller, it's a huge step down. And we recognized at the time that there was probably going to be something big coming out about the Secret Service. Well, what's coming out about the Secret Service is that when they were supposed to transfer over all their messages from January 5th and January 6th, oopsie poopsie, they're missing. Okay, that's not okay. Texts don't just go missing. You know, your socks just go missing in the dryer. Secret Service texts just do not go missing. And now, of course, there's all kinds of stories swirling about whether they were lost in some kind of a move that I'm not even a tech person. I can tell you that doesn't pass the smell test. Now they're saying, oh, they were deleted, and and again, you would not do that. You would not be able to make them irretrievable unless you had really high clearance. So so there we sit. Now the National Archives and Records Administration has gotten in on the act, saying, hey, it's illegal to have gotten rid of these. The January 6th committee has gotten in on it. And there's a real question. Are these things really unrecoverable? And my rule, since I worked at MIT and talked to people there who did tech stuff, is that nothing ever goes away. Now, obviously, there must be some exception to that, but we'll see. But it is worth this fact, which is a fact on the ground, that what they did if they erased those texts is they broke the law. And they knew they were breaking the law. And they were breaking the law in a really obvious way. So what was in those texts was worse than that. Now the question is there some way to reconstruct those texts so we can find out just how bad that is? That's not clear. But at the very least, it means that the Secret Service is about to be the group that, as I say, as people say, goes into the barrel. So that's why those texts are important, because they'll fill in more about what was happening on January 6th, but they also say a lot about the attempt on the part of the former administration to destroy our nonpartisan civil service. And that's a really big deal. All right, so that's one thing you asked about. You did not ask about it because it hadn't happened yet, but I just want to point out that today, 17 members of Congress, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Representative Presley, I think, I don't remember them all off the top of my head, 17 of them have been arrested for blocking the road in front of the Supreme Court without a permit because they're protesting the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health decision, which overturned Roe versus Wade. And I don't know any more about that right now, except that they were arrested for, among other things, discommoding or incommoding. I don't know what the word is, but I just love that. You know, if I ever get arrested, I want it to be for incommoding or discommoding. And that is obviously a protest over where the country is going with regard to the constitutional right of to terminate a pregnancy. And there's a wonderful, wonderful article today in the Washington Post about the historical background of that and how the framers themselves said that abortion was a private matter and did not, even though they knew of a specific case in which a woman had terminated a second trimester pregnancy, they did not consider that something that they had any business interfering in. All right, so more questions here. People are concerned about the fact that Donald Trump has said, allegedly, although there were 4 witnesses to it, to the fact that he wants to declare that he's running for president because that will keep him from being indicted. So the story behind that is that, yes, the Department of Justice has a memo, it's not a law, a memo that says that a sitting president you can't go after a sitting president for most crimes. Probably not all crimes, but most crimes. And that was passed in the not passed, that it was written in the wake of Watergate, because what they were concerned about was the idea that you could stop a president from being able to function simply by continuing to throw lawsuits at him, so that he couldn't function. He spent all his time trying to keep himself out of jail. And the Republicans actually made inroads on that under the Bill Clinton administration, when in fact the Supreme Court decided that a president did have to testify in the lawsuit that eventually ended up getting Clinton impeached. So there are limits to that, but more important than that is the recognition that you can't do that to try and make sure you don't get prosecuted. That's we are in obviously enormously uncharted waters here, but I don't think any court would, I mean, I shouldn't say that. It is a stretch to say that you can run for office to avoid being indicted for crimes. And I will say, in terms of what Trump says he's going to do, I think it's long past time people freak out over anything he says he's going to do. We have a pattern of behavior. We know what he will act like, and that's enough to be going on. But his whole use of rumors and trial balloons and all that is an enormous waste of everybody's time. So he might declare, he might not. And if he does declare, there are huge implications for that, because that would make these midterms a referendum on him. And so the Republicans, who know he's enormously unpopular, increasingly even among Republicans, are urging him not to jump into the race. So will he do it? Who knows? Is that going to make a difference in terms of whether or not he's prosecuted for potential crimes? We'll see. Like I say, I'm not losing sleep about that. I have a hard time believing that Fannie Willis, for example, from Fulton County in Georgia, is going to say, oh, well, we'll just wait 4 years, when she basically has him on tape trying to commit a crime. So we'll see. You have asked then also about whether Merrick Garland is going to go after Trump, and what about this memo that Rachel Maddow read and made such a big deal about the other day. None of us knows the future. I will tell you that I am not nearly as concerned about that memo as many people seem to be. It read to me as if it was a set of guidelines that the Department of Justice has always operated under. And while everybody is focused on Trump, of course, it is a reminder of trying to be apolitical in any number of races across the country. So to me, it just seemed like this, like, and I hope nobody takes offense by this, especially him if he's watching. It seemed to me very much like the sorts of memos the dean sends out before finals week every year, in which he reminds us what the rules are around finals week, and there, I won't say it's boilerplate, but it did not seem to me to indicate anything that we didn't already know. Now, that doesn't answer the question of whether or not Merrick Garland is going to go after Donald Trump for criminal liability. I will say everything that Garland has said indicates that he will go where the law leads. And he is known as a Boy Scout who does care about the law. And of course, he went after the Oklahoma City bombers. And I believe that's his big case. And I'm going to continue to have faith that he is doing this by the book and that it's going to happen. Now, I want to say a little bit more about that because I think it matters. And that is one of the things that seems very clear to people who study authoritarianism is that in order to restore democracy, the answer is not to go after the people who tried to destroy it in the first place because they tried to destroy it in the first place. The answer is to rest on the rule of law, even if that means some people get away. And my example of that is I'm going to draw from East and West Germany. There is a wonderful study of what happened to Germany after World War II. And it takes a look at how the East Germans went after Nazis because they were known to be Nazis, and they went after them and threw the book at them regardless of whether or not the law was on their side. And what came from that was, of course, the rise of authoritarianism in the Eastern Bloc. In the West, they went after Nazis only according to the rule of law, and some of them got away with their crimes. But what they did is they reestablished the rule of law as the foundational principle of that part of the world. And that distinction, I think, really matters in this moment, because if some people are going to get away, and I'm not suggesting it's Donald Trump. I actually, if I had to guess, would say I do expect him to be indicted. I don't expect him ever to end up behind bars, because I think he will continue to throw crap at the wall until the clock runs out. But I do think, if I had to guess, my guess is he will be indicted either in New York or in Georgia, or possibly at the federal level. It does seem to me that the cases are building up. Certainly people I respect believe that there's already enough evidence in the public sphere to charge him. I'm not a lawyer, so I wouldn't know that. I will say that what I do is I read the tea leaves around things like indictments, and that I'm very good at. And I will tell you that Trump is very nervous. He is very nervous right now about having to testify under oath in New York, which was supposed to happen last Friday, and his ex-wife died the day before, so it didn't happen. And he is very nervous about Georgia. He is also, his associates are also very nervous about what's happening with the January 6th committee. And one of the things you do is you watch those people who are perhaps less stable than some other people who are looser with their cards. And this is one of the reasons I've been watching the representative from Texas, Ronnie Jackson, who seems to be completely melting down over the idea of the January 6th committee continuing to probe what happened on that day. And you know, if you're not concerned about lawsuits, you don't talk about them a lot. So a great example of this is, you may remember that some of the people who work for Stephen Colbert got caught doing something in the Capitol, being somewhere they shouldn't be or something. You never heard about it, and that case has gone away. I believe it's been quashed or something, because it just was part of the business of being at that level of engagement in the public. There's a lot of lawyers involved a lot of the time, and lots of people just figure it's, you know, part of the cost of doing business. When you really start to melt down over a lawsuit, that means that it's hitting you somewhere it hurts. And that's one thing I'm watching. And I will tell you that, for example, Hillary Clinton did not seem terribly concerned about Steve Bannon. I'm sorry, Nancy Pelosi, not Hillary Clinton. Nancy Pelosi did not seem terribly concerned that Steve Bannon was trying to subpoena her. And in fact, a judge just quashed that. But Steve Bannon seems very concerned about the fact that he had to answer a subpoena. So watch how people are behaving. And if you watch how they're behaving, I think that a lot of people in Trump's orbit seem extraordinarily nervous right now and very concerned about where things are going. All right, so I don't know the answer. Is Garland going to charge him? I don't know. When Garland picks up the phone and calls me, I'll let you know. But don't hold your breath, let me tell you. All right, another question. You asked about Steve Bannon's trial. Remember that what they're fighting over what has a very low penalty, relatively low penalty. But what that fight really is about is whether or not we are going to abide by the rule of law, and whether Trump can just say, no, my people don't have to testify. And Bannon is famous for being a chaos agent, is what they call him. And he says, I'm going to be as difficult as I possibly can be. And he's trying just to gum up the works. That is really, he is trying to be sort of a, I was going to say Tasmanian devil from the cartoon, but I don't really want to do that because the actual animals are lovely. But, you know, somebody who's just kind of a tornado. He's trying to be a tornado. And destroy our rule of law by being that tornado, by gumming up the works so badly that nothing can get done. It's going to be a pretty short trial, it certainly looks like. He's thrown everything possible he can at the wall, and yet the judge keeps pushing back and not letting him delay, not letting him get away with things. And of course, what he was trying to do was to delay his trial until after the midterms with the hopes that Republicans would take the House and do something to make sure his that the contempt didn't stick. Exactly what that would have been, I don't know. Again, I don't know those rules nearly as well as I would have liked to. I did spend a great deal of time trying to figure it out the other night and had no luck. So what's going to happen to Bannon? I don't know. But the point is not so much what's going to happen to Biden as what's going to happen to the rule of law over this quite stupid, in a way, little case in terms of the outcome of it. But it's quite a huge case in terms of whether Congress can enforce its will, or the president gets to say, even a president who's no longer in office gets to shut his people up. And from that perspective, it's really quite interesting. Bannon's an interesting figure. And that brings us into another question you asked, which is, can I give a history of American conservatism from a historical viewpoint? And yes, I would love to do this because I am fascinated by conservatism. And especially by American conservatism, which is not really the same thing as conservatism in general. So, conservatism as a body of thought actually emerges from a reaction to the French Revolution. And in the French Revolution, the concept of the rule of the people really quickly got out of what many people would call got out of hand. And when it did so with the executions, for example, thinkers in Britain who had supported the American Revolution because it was a revolution based on the rule of law turned against the French Revolution. And one of the leaders of that was a man named Edmund Burke. And Burke took a look at the French Revolution and thought about the principles of government. And that's one of the things that I really care a lot about, the principles of government. Like, what does it mean? You know, some people say we don't need government at all. I disagree with that. If we don't have government, I think really quickly you end up with gangs who enforce their will on other people through the use of violence. And my great example of that, of course, is the regulator movement. Of course, I'm sorry, I'm a historian. Is the regulator movements, especially in North Carolina, in the colonies before the American Revolution, where there wasn't the rule of law for various reasons, not least because the lawmakers back east hadn't appropriated money for them, and because it was not possible to get your horse back when someone stole it, or protect your daughters from rape, or protect your property. People created their own gangs that were essentially well, they called them, it's the regulator movement. They were essentially posses or their own sorts of militias. Actually, Joanna and I talked about that in this week's Now and Then. And the issue with that is, of course, they become clannish very, very quickly. And they decide what the law is and what evidence is. And that is, I think, in a situation like that, there is no sense of equality, and you have to sign your protection over to somebody that you think can take care of you, which means you have to do whatever they say. And that very quickly devolves into the sorts of systems in which, you know, very few well-armed and generally wealthy people control everything. And of course, that's a number of societies, both in the past and in the present now. But so I don't believe that there is, that we can really live without any kind of government, which is what libertarians try to argue. And there's that doesn't work for me. But the question of what kind of society does work is a really important question. So the people who were reacting to the French Revolution took a look at what they saw as the extremes of democracy, because the American Revolution they had seen as a conservative, you know, as a rule of law revolution. They're not using the word conservative yet. And they looked at the French Revolution and they went, whoa, doggies, we don't want that. You know, look at that. You got mobs essentially just going after people. And all of us know that mob rule is really terrifying, because people do things in mobs that they would not do in a reasoned situation. And one of my, I guess I probably shouldn't identify which it is, but you can all think of photographs in which an individual is doing something horrific. And I studied, worked with a teacher who had been the teacher of one of those people doing something horrific. And he still, all those years later, would shake his head and say, he's the last kid you would have expected to do that. And yet he did it, you know, whipped up by the mob. And so you don't want mob rule either. Well, so Edmund Burke looked at what was happening in the French Revolution, and he saw mob rule. So he said, okay, we got to figure out how to have a government that works. And what he said many things in very long, boring ways, by the way. But one of the things he said was that it was a real error. And I urge you to listen to this, because this really matters. It was a real error to try to form a government based in an ideology. And he's thinking about the ideology of democracy. But I think that concept is, you can extrapolate that to, say, an ideology of religion, for example, or of authoritarianism, or any kind of an ideology, because what he said was that pretty soon, if you form a government around an ideology, lawmakers will start to try and make the people fit the ideology rather than the ideology fitting the people. So that's how you got things like the purges of the French Revolution, because not everybody agreed with the ideology. And so what do? You get rid of the people, you don't change the ideology. And the reason I said please pay attention to that is because this is something that I've spent my entire professional life doing, is identifying that the current day Republican Party is enslaved to an ideology that they are trying to force us all to fit into, and we don't. So Burke says we need to govern not based on ideology, but so what should a government do? If it's not going to enforce a religion or an ideology, what's it going to do? Well, he says, what a government should do is it should create stability. It should make the country stable enough that people feel like they're not going to get killed and or lose all their property, or, you know, fall apart. So in order to do that, a government should protect the rule of law so that, you know, people know what's coming next. And it should protect the institutions that create stability. Institutions like the church, institutions like the family, and institutions like government, and others as well, the courts. But that concept that a government should protect stability is quite different than that it should protect an ideology. And he went on to say that governments should not be rigidly bound by an idea so much as by this desire to protect stability. And that being the case, they should try stuff. And if it doesn't work, they should change it and try something else. They should be experience-based, not ideologically based. So that idea of government based in experimentation and seeing what works, and based in protecting stability. Of course, you can see how in many ways, and I don't know anything about British conservatism after this, it goes in ways that can be ultra religious. It can protect the aristocracy. It can protect traditional family structures. But it also fundamentally says, it's got a lot of, like all ideas, it has a lot of pieces that different people use. It also fundamentally says we don't want a government that is based in ideology. All right, so that's what Burke is talking about. That does not come to America, because America at that point doesn't have anything really to fight against. It's still deciding what its own history is. And it doesn't really know yet what that is. So it's not like you need to fight back against an ideology. They're still figuring stuff out in the early republic. And so nobody really talks about conservatism in America, conserving anything. Americans don't have anything to conserve in the early republic. So the idea of conservatism in America comes much later. And the idea of conservatism in America actually rises at the time of the abolitionist movement, especially in the 1850s, when abolitionists begin to say that they will not abide by the Compromise of 1850 because of its Fugitive Slave Act, and which says that even free states have to return fugitives to the southern states. And northern people say that's not happening. We're not going to do that. We don't want to return enslaved people to their enslavers. They made it here, they can stay here. And when they said they would not agree to that part of the law, Southern enslavers started to call them radicals. They were radicals. They were radical abolitionists, and they were radical because they would not abide by the rule of law in this particular law. This particular piece of the Compromise of 1850. Well, that kind of sticks for a while. The idea that if you wanted to get rid of the Fugitive Slave Act, you were a radical, and that somehow if you were therefore an abolitionist, which is a movement that takes off in the 1830s to try and stop human enslavement, that's somehow you're a radical because you are trying, that kind of bleeds into the idea of changing society. Well, the reason I mention that is because in the middle of the 1850s, a president gives a long, really boring speech about, and mind you, I love this stuff. So if I say it's boring, take my word for it, about how America has always been deeply rooted in enslavement. And abolitionists and abolitionist sympathizers look at this and they're like, wait just a freaking second. He's inventing all this. This didn't happen. This is not the way our history transpired. So they write their own history that takes us back to the Declaration of Independence. And they say, wait a minute, if you're really going to look at the way our country is, look at the Declaration of Independence. We can't go back further than that. And that says all men are created equal. So don't call us radicals because we want all men to be created equal. We're actually trying to conserve. Ooh. They start to talk about being conservatives because they are protecting the Declaration of Independence. And Abraham Lincoln picks this up. Abraham Lincoln begins to insist that he is a conservative, or he is conservative. He doesn't use the article A. He is conservative because he wants to protect the Declaration of Independence. He's trying to conserve the past, conserve the stability of the past. This is obviously, they're completely not talking about Burke. I actually got into this a few years ago, and this is actually in my new book. And I did a search for Edmund Burke in the Lincoln Papers, which is everything Lincoln that we have now that Lincoln produced. There was more, but his son burned it. Don't start me on that. And the only time he mentions Edmund Burke is, it appears, and I don't remember now what the man was. I think he was a White House usher or a White House butler, and his name was Edmund Burke. That's the only time Lincoln ever refers to Burke that I could find anyway. And he's not referring to the thinker, the thinker from the UK. So he starts to talk about American conservatism being protecting the Declaration of Independence. That's not what today's conservatives do. Today's conservatives picked up that moniker in 1937 when they were trying to get rid of the New Deal. And they said, we want to go back to before the New Deal. Therefore, we are conservatives. And we're going essentially to reclaim that same turf that the enslavers that Lincoln stood against stood on. And they began to call themselves conservatives, saying that they were going back before the radical New Deal. Well, even at the time, there were very few of them. Even at the time, people were like, wait a minute here. We've got a system that works. We've got a system that has stood the test of time, and it's creating stability. We're, with the New Deal, we got the people, from being homeless and unrooted, and the incredible divorce rate and abandonment rate of the New Deal, of the Depression, and the suicide rate. All that's gone because we figured out how to take care of that. They ignored all that and said, we are going to be conservatives because we're going to go back before that to the world before that, the world that created the Great Crash and the Great Depression. So it is completely, to my mind, a misnomer. When people today call themselves conservatives, they were rejecting all those things that Republicans as well as Democrats had put into place after the Great Crash and the ascension of FDR to the White House in 1933. And that New Deal, I would argue, was conservative because it protected stability and it did not reflect ideology. FDR did not care about ideology. He cared about stabilizing the country so he could protect democracy. Quite a bit like Abraham Lincoln had done, and quite a bit like Lincoln had done when he stood on the Declaration of Independence. So the trick to conservatism is that it is supposed to protect those things that stabilize a country: the rule of law, the judicial system, families, and property. All things that are themes that can be perverted, but that can also be used, I think, in really incredibly stabilizing and popular ways, like we're in a moment in which we are sitting like right now. And to that, then I want to pop into the next question that somebody asked about, and that was, what do I think about Jamie Raskin, who is a representative from Maryland? What do I think about his argument that comes from a book called How Democracies Die by Zyblatt and crap, I can never remember the other guy. I'm sorry, other guy. He says that the center left and the center right have to come together to push back against the now authoritarianism on the part of those radicals who now control the Republican Party. And I'm 100% on board that. I'm 100% on board that, because that, in fact, is, of course, what Zyblatt and the other guy, say is they look at how authoritarians around the world have lost power, and what they have said is that you can't keep trying to do it on your own and splintering. You have to swallow hard and work with people with whom you disagree on every other front until you get the authoritarian out of power. You don't have to stay with them after that, although what that generally tends to do is it mixes stuff up a lot, and people that previously were your deadly enemies, you've found middle ground with them, and you might create something new. But you swallow hard and you work with people like Liz Cheney, who is, voted with Donald Trump I think it's more than 92% of the time. It's certainly more than 90% of the time. She and I disagree on probably pretty much everything. But right now, I'm her biggest fan because she is working to protect democracy from authoritarianism. Let me take that story back a little bit more, though. That's exactly what Lincoln did. And he was very articulate about it. The whole idea of pushing back against the authoritarianism that was embodied by the elite enslavers in the American South called for making peace across political parties. And political parties in the North were not simply the Whigs and the Democrats. There were the Free Soil Democrats. There were who wanted to stop slavery. There were the Know Nothing Party, which was an anti-immigrant party. There were all kinds of different parties. There were they called themselves socialists, but they weren't actually socialists. They were utopian people. Yeah, there was this ferment in the American North, and people did not agree about anything. But under people like Lincoln, they came together to protect the American constitutional system. And from that, many of them ended up jumping parties. So, for example, Gideon Welles, who became Lincoln's Secretary of War, was a staunch Democrat, and Lincoln brought him into the cabinet. And by the end of Lincoln's term, Welles was such a supporter of Lincoln that when Lincoln was assassinated, Welles wandered Washington, unable to speak, unable to function, to the point that people were worried about his mental health. They thought that he was never going to recover. He just couldn't handle losing Lincoln. If you had told him he was going to feel that way 5 years before or 10 years before, when he was a staunch Democrat working against the Whigs, he'd have been like, I don't know where you're coming from, but that's not going to happen. The point is that the attempt to put down a rising authoritarian movement brought together people who otherwise had nothing in common, and Lincoln did that very deliberately. And he talked about how, after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, when we all realized we were in big trouble because the enslavers were going to take over the federal government, we all rose, and I never quite get this quotation correct, but something to the effect, and I use it a lot, something to the effect of we rose, it's in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, because Douglas said, in 1858, Douglas said, Lincoln's got this whole ragtag group of people behind him. There's no political party behind him. These people don't stand for anything, and they're all just radicals, and you shouldn't follow them. And he says, well, we all came together because of people like you who want to spread enslavement and destroy our democratic system. And we rose, after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, we rose and put out our hands to whatever was at hand. Scythes, axes, whatever. And he uses all these wonderful work tools to say, we took whatever tools we had to try and make sure we preserved American democracy. And right now we're all working together. Now, when we make sure that our country stands, that doesn't mean we're going to continue to work together. But for now, we can all come together to make sure you people don't destroy our democracy. And it worked. Now, one of the ways that it worked for Abraham Lincoln was constantly to hit on our foundational principles, the Declaration of Independence. Our founders, who cared about the principles on which they were forming this government, said, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And I have pointed out repeatedly that they used a mathematical formula. And it's a mathematical formula that Lincoln, who read Euclid, by the way, later picks up in the Gettysburg Address, in which the framers say, we hold these truths to be self-evident. It's a mathematical formula, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they have the right to consent to their government. The legitimacy of government depends on the consent of the governed. That's not all the self-evident truths in the world, according to the founders. It's among them are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and the right to consent to your government. When Lincoln talks about that in 1863, he says, 77 years ago, back with the Declaration of Independence, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition, mathematical proposition, that all men are created equal. It's no longer a self-evident truth the way the founders talked about it. It's a proposition. And he says we have to go ahead and make this proposition a reality, because it's no longer obvious that it is self-evident. The proposition that all men are created equal. We are now engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived can long endure. He's saying, can we make that truth self-evident again and not simply make it a proposition? Okay, so why have I harped on that? One of the reasons that I talk so much about our history and our shared values, and the shared values of this country, which is that it is a country formed in the rule of law, and that it is a country in which we have been most powerful when we strived to include others in the idea of equality, is that if we define our nation that way, I do believe that we can find middle ground across political divides for now, not necessarily forever. I get so tired of people on Twitter when I retweet people who are far, to my mind, far right-wing Republicans, or even people, people on the far left, and people say, why do you trust that person? You're being hoodwinked. I'm not being hoodwinked. In this moment, we need all hands on deck. That does not mean I'm going to be working with them in 10 years or even 2 years if we get past this moment. But this is a moment when everybody should come together. And I want now to turn to another place where somebody is doing that. And that was the video that I retweeted yesterday and I wrote about in my letter from Mothers Against Greg Abbott. Because that seems to me to be a great example of a place where people are coming together across political boundaries to say, wait a minute, we need to take this country back. And they are using the language of Uncle Tom's Cabin, even though they're probably not aware of it. And I hope someone who talks to them is watching this. Uncle Tom's Cabin became an enormously influential book in the attempt to push back against the authoritarianism of the enslavers in the books published in 1852, after the Compromise of 1850 puts the Fugitive Slave Act in place. And the emphasis of Uncle Tom's Cabin, if you have not read it, and it's kind of worth reading, honestly, recognizing that it is what it is. I mean, my students often find it overly flowery, but you have to remember that that book was written by a mother for other mothers who did not consider themselves at the time politically motivated. And what she talked about in Uncle Tom's Cabin repeatedly was how, at the time, men in charge of the American government had passed laws that were destroying a woman's ability to care for her children. And that message resonated so deeply in the 1850s that apocryphally Lincoln greeted Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote that book, with the words, "So this is the little lady who caused this great big war." Now, she didn't cause a great big war, but what she did do is she made people think again about what our government is supposed to do. And in that, perhaps she was supremely conservative by talking about the preservation of family and of making sure that people can have the safety to rear their children without, as the Mothers Against Greg Abbott talked about in the video, without unlimited access to military-style weapons, without the attacks on abortion that have been enshrined in our constitutional rights for 49 years, and before that were part of the way Americans managed their families. Remember, it was Republicans really who were behind Planned Parenthood in the second half of the 19th century, and even to some degree before it. People like Preston Bush, for example. And the reason I wanted to single out the Mothers Against Greg Abbott is because you always ask me what you can do to change this moment. And I think this is the moment to really take a lesson from Lincoln, where he talked about us all reaching for whatever tools were to hand to try and reclaim the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the idea that we are all created equal, and that we all have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that we have a right to consent to our government. And that fundamental set of values applied to all Americans, not just to a certain group of Americans, is one that I think a lot of us who might disagree about tax rates, for example, or who might disagree about speed limit laws, can agree on and can be willing to work on together against those who say that they are deliberately trying to overturn those fundamental American values. And the Mothers Against Greg Abbott have had this viral video that is enormously powerful, and you just never know. And I've got this, and I promise you, if you'd told me 3 years ago that I would be doing this on a beautiful July day, I'd have said, I couldn't begin to guess what you're talking about. And yet I think this is the moment for people to reach out, not only through voting yourself, not only through running for office, not only for holding media's feet to the fire and saying, wait a minute, why aren't you talking about anything positive that Biden has done when in fact he's got an enormously successful track record? Not only trying to change the public conversation in macro ways, but also talking to your friends the same way Lincoln did, the same way that Harriet Beecher Stowe did when she made sure that her book got into people's hands, that her letters got into people's hands, that we come together to try and work together against the rise of authoritarianism. And in the process, if the past is any guide, and of course I think it is, we will reconceive how to be Americans and how to create a world that really does embody the principles, the very noble principles, for all that they were not themselves noble men, that the founders embodied in the Declaration of Independence. All right, I am going to get back to it. I hope that was somewhat useful. And I will, I suspect, be back on Thursday. All right, thank you for being here, and I will see you tonight. In writing, I mean. I'm not going to be back on video. Thanks for being here.